Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Peter Copeland, Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And today we are here to tackle one of the defining issues of our time, Canada's housing affordability and supply challenges, and how they intersect with demographics. So we'll be looking at immigration, family formation, and our aging and changing population. And I want to stress that I think it's not just an affordability problem. It's a question of whether Canadians can build the kind of lives that they want to marry, have children, own a home, and live in stable communities. And yet, our policy frameworks across housing, immigration, family, and demographics often pull in different directions. And so too does our individualistic, work oriented culture. And I know that this is a personal issue now for many. And at MLI, we think housing policy is more than just about prices and permits and zoning and these sorts of things. It's about people and about the kind of society that we want to build. And that's why I'm very thrilled to bring together a panel of diverse perspectives on these issues, as there are many facets to this complicated policy question. So first, we have Lyman Stone, who is a demographer and director of research at the Institute for Family Studies, as well as the chief information officer at the Pro-Natalist Institute, and also, I should say, a fellow at Canada's very own Cardis think tank. And he brings a global perspective on fertility, family policy, and migration trends. And second, we have Parisa Mabudi, who is a senior policy analyst at the C.D. Howe Institute and one of Canada's leading experts on demographics, immigration, and labor market policy. And last but not least, we have Sam Duncan, who is a vice president at Wellington Advocacy, a former director of policy to Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and advisor to Prime Minister Harper. And he writes frequently on family formation and demographic issues. And before we get started, I just want to remind everyone to please remember to like and subscribe. It really helps us reach more people with these important ideas. So Lyman, Parisa, and Sam, thanks for being with us. Great. So I'll turn it over to each of you just to introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your work and a few key ideas that pertain to the issues we're discussing today. Lyman, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much for bringing us all on to be part of this panel. Housing, especially as it relates to family, is a huge issue. If you ask a young person to visualize the postcard that they're going to send to all their friends around Christmas time when they're 40, and you just ask them, visualize that postcard, who's on it? What do you see? They might tell you a number of children. They'll probably mention a spouse. But if you push a little deeper, they'll almost always say, oh, yeah, and there's this like house behind us. And you can usually end up like, and is it made of brick? And they're like, yes, it's made of brick. So housing matters a lot for family. Like you said, I'm the director of the Pronatalism Initiative at the Institute for Family Studies, where housing is a huge part of our agenda right now, particularly studying the kinds of housing reforms that will support families, support young people in starting families and growing their families. I also do forecasting work where my job is not to say what should happen, but what will happen with fertility. And in that capacity, the lines are going down. Birth rates are occasionally they'll bump up for a year and then they go back down. Birth rates are falling in most countries around the world. And they can fall to very low levels, less than one child per woman. And so that is why I think this is an important issue to be talking about right now, is because things can get much worse.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thanks, Lyman. Parisa, over to you.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I'm
There we go.
trying.
Now you're
Can you hear
unmuted.
me? Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for having me. I'm Parisa Mahboubi, a senior policy analyst at the City Howe Institute. I lead Human Capital Policy Program, which include issues related to immigration and demographic policies. So I looking at how these issues are shaped and shape Canada's economic and social foundations are really important and have been focus of my research. And we are here talking about all these issues, and it's really important to point that housing and immigration now they are really related together, because we've seen significant increases in immigration in recent years, and it seems because the housing shortages we are facing, we are thinking, okay, immigration is responsible for the problem that we have. I'm here to discuss that and realize what are the issues behind that, and also what we can do in the future to not face similar situation, and how to ensure that the housing and immigration can go together well and actually create a life for everyone in Canada.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Parisa. Yeah, I look forward to diving into those issues. It's come on people's radar, all of a sudden, just in the most recent years. So it's certainly a factor, but not, I think, as you're suggesting, the whole story. So great. Sam, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, everyone. My name is Sam Duncan. I'm a vice president at Wellington Advocacy, full suite government relations firm. I've worked in politics directly for premier and for prime minister, as well as cabinet ministers. So I kind of live and breathe the politics of some of these challenges and some of these issues. And in my day job right now, we kind of help organizations and companies navigate government and help try to actually solve for some of these issues. And I've worked with some folks on housing issues and other issues directly. And I think today I'd like to kind of talk about and try to explore kind of how we got here and the choices we've made, and really want to say that, both, it's been collectively on both kind of left and right governments and all sides have made a number of decisions over the last 20, 30 years that all individually you can say are either have some good element of public policy behind it or good politics. But when combined, they have created a situation today that is pretty dire. And I think really when it comes down to it is we haven't obviously built enough homes for the amount of people, but we also haven't really understood what people want, and the changing nature of individuals making individual choices, be that individuals choosing to have fewer kids, individuals choosing to get married later in life or not get married at all, older people and seniors choosing to stay in their homes longer, not choosing to not have multi-generational families. All of these things are individual choices that people are making, that are contributing to the housing challenge and housing issues. And governments, at the end of the day, it's politics. They're reflecting back the choices and interests of their voters. And what we've seen over the last few decades is governments reflecting the interests of their voters. But now we've come to a point when the system's broken, and the system's been broken. And now politicians are kind of waking up, because people are waking up and saying the current status quo is not acceptable. And I think today would love to unpack how do we get our politics to think a little bit more generationally and not so focused on individuals in the individual moment, but rather think more horizontally and linearly across time scales. And we need our politics to change if we're going to actually solve these problems in a public policy way.
Yeah, that's great, Sam, and I'm glad we have two researchers on different sides of these questions, and then someone to talk about the politics and policy implementation, because you certainly need both to move the needle. So let's dive right in. I want to touch on the intersection of these issues, so housing, demographics, and family formation. What is the connection in your view, and then how also does immigration fit into this picture? Love to hear from each of you. So why don't we go in reverse order this time? Sam, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah. So look, I would maybe start by saying in Canada, We've had a lot of government policy that's really supported kind of the massive debt-fueled asset inflation in our housing market. We as Canadians have viewed our homes as investments, and I think fundamentally our public policy has oriented around that. As a financial investment, low interest rates have certainly played a pretty big role in that. At the same time, we've had a number of really protectionist policies by governments that I would say for various reasons, a lot of them very good, environmental reasons to protect, protected lands to not develop on. Like there's lots of good reasons why some of these protectionist measures have come into place, but there's also, municipal red tape. Obviously the NIMBY movement has been very big, that has compounded these things. As well, like I mentioned, family formation is changing. People are choosing to form their families in different ways than they have in the past. That is playing a very, I think, increasing role. We need more homes for the same amount of people based upon how we form our families today versus how we formed our families even 20 or 30 years ago. Public policy has not addressed that. We have not kind of combated those things and acknowledged that these are choices that people are making. Why are people making these choices? Is there a role for government into change and try to incentivize people to make different choices? That's a tough problem to solve, and not one that I think politicians are attuned to today. At the same time, we have this kind of fragile system that we just kind of broke with massive immigration over the past few years. Massive immigration of guest workers to the temporary foreign worker program, and massive immigration at unseen levels in the past, at a time when our system was pretty fragile at a housing level. And so it really I think has broken our system, and it's all of these factors kind of individually playing a role that have led to now where people are waking up and saying, hey, this isn't working, we need to fix this. And I think in order to fix it, we're gonna have to look at all of these various factors. And it's not just about fixing some red tape measures or lowering development charges for developers to fix these problems. They're deeper problems. And a lot of the problems are people are making these choices, and they want the choices they're making. So how do we acknowledge that, and how do we address and adapt public policy to achieve that?
Okay, that's a great start. Parisa.
Yes, absolutely. So when in terms of the connection between these factors that you pointed to, let's just start with what's happening here. So we are facing very low fertility rates, well below the replacement rate, and this is not unique to Canada; it's everywhere. Because of the shift that we are seeing, in terms of the cultural shifts, and at the same time, people live longer. So we are facing a population without immigration. We would have faced even negative population growth. So we needed immigration, and we bring immigrants to Canada every year. Before pandemic, it was at a consistent rate. But post-pandemic, we increased that significantly, not only permanent immigration, but also temporary immigration. That's really essential for population growth and labor force growth. But at the same time, if housing is not responding well to the growth that we've seen, and we expected to have immigration, at least to some specific levels. But the thing about immigration is two things that policymakers need to consider when they are thinking about the responses to the population growth through immigration. First of all, there is immediate demand for housing. It's not like childbearing that is going to take years for a child to grow up and demands, to enter the labor market. Immigrants, as soon as they arrive, they need a place to live. So there is an immediate demand for immigration. So that's why it is really important to connect immigration policy with housing policy, and they need to be connected tightly. And also in terms of something about the housing and immigration, we should recognize that it shouldn't be, the discussion should be about Canada. It's a regional matters. It's when it comes to housing, we don't have housing crisis and shortages everywhere. And even in terms of the affordability, and also in terms of immigration, immigrants, they don't distribute across Canada evenly. So that's a problem when it comes to immigration. Several regions and urban centers, they are more attractive to immigrants, and also for any Canadians, they are looking for better jobs and better opportunities. So we have to think about all these factors, and then come up with the policy recommendation and discuss about, for example, how housing and immigration are connected.
Okay. Before going to you, Lyman, I just want to drill down on some of those points. I think that's great. You mentioned, obviously, we can't generalize too much. It's there are concentrated issues in our urban centers, both with respect to housing supply and then where immigrants are concentrated. And we've just seen recent data here from the CMHC and some of our other housing data entities that our new housing starts are down considerably. And most of that decline is concentrated in BC and Ontario and in the greater Vancouver and Toronto areas in particular. So, Parisa, I want to ask you further about this connection between immigration, the recent surge, and some of the housing issues we've had. I know you've also written in the past about, kind of a somewhat less talked about aspect of immigration, the student visa immigration and its impact on housing and economics. So what would you have to say about those questions?
Sure, absolutely. So when it comes to immigration, as you mentioned, this is really important to think about. Immigration is not just permanent immigration. We need and also admit and bring temporary immigrants to Canada, for example, international students that contribute to our economy. But when it comes to housing, first of all, in terms of their needs, we are talking about different type of population, even among immigrants, permanent immigrants, international students, temporary foreign workers. They have different types of needs when it comes to housing. And some of them, they are just looking for rentals. Some others, long-term permanent immigrants, they tend to look for, they tend to own their places and own their houses, and they have different preferences when it comes to housing. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to temporary immigration, unfortunately, until recently, that we saw significant increase. We haven't even measured this population precisely and in an accurate way. So mm-hmm. that's a problem that we are facing. We saw significant increase that without even knowing how many people are in Canada at a specific time. We know, for example, in regards to permanent immigrants, and we track individuals arriving, but we don't track those who are leaving. And many of those, even in terms of, for example, where they reside, yes, of course, for example, for international students, is more easier and understandable in terms of they are around the university or colleges that they are located. So that's why also in terms of, for example, location, when it comes to international students, so they tend to reside in regions that they can provide better educational quality, which again related to provinces that mainly they are facing already housing issues. So when we talk about immigration, first of all, we need to consider all groups, including international students, and consider their different needs. And also we need better data to know how many people are here, the type of their needs, and how we can respond.
Yeah, I think it's, many people find it shocking that we don't know how many people we have in various categories here. But before, again, turning to you, Lyman, Parisa, I just want to ask, what's the relationship between immigration and housing in recent years when we've seen these shocks? I know there's been a lot of talk about its impact on supply and affordability in those urban areas in particular.
Sure, absolutely. So when it comes to the impact of immigration on housing, so when we are seeing a significant increase in the number of immigration, it means immediate demand for housing market, and it's going to put pressure on some specific regions. And so that immediate is going to increase the prices. It makes housing unaffordable. And one of the reasons actually we are seeing this in terms of the constructions, it has declined in 2025 in regions that and cities that we expect to build more to address housing shortages is affordability issues. When immigrants and newcomers, they are not able to find a place to live, and they are not, the housing market is unaffordable for them. The demand is, there are differences between the demand and need. So when there is not demand, when they are not able to get a place, so that's why, for example, those builders, they don't have incentive to build more houses and add to the labor market, to the housing market. But at the same time, how immigration affect housing? So immigration, the significant increase in immigration is going to make housing market more unaffordable. It increases the prices. So there will be some basically dissatisfaction across all Canadians. So people, non-immigrants also face challenges in finding a place to reside. Young individuals entering the labor market and entering the housing market, they want to form the family, they're facing high prices, and it's going to actually affect immigration policy, because people are going to attack immigration and basically making immigration responsible for the housing crisis and shortages and unaffordability that we are facing. In some extent, it's true, because we increased immigration without appropriate response. But at the same time, we see that we see a shift in immigration policy, because the government had to decrease the immigration numbers significantly last year to respond to these dissatisfaction we are facing, even though we need immigrants.
Right. Yeah, it is. It's an unfortunate situation, and certainly these issues predated the recent spike, but the spike certainly exacerbated it, and in those areas where it's worse. So thank you for that. We'll return to some of these issues, but Lyman, over to you for your thoughts on the connection between these issues.
So I think Parisa talked very well about the affordability issue. I think everybody has a sense of that it's just very hard for young people to get suitable housing now. I think Sam covered a lot of the political issues. I think one thing that sometimes gets swept under the rug is actually, Parisa hit on this a bit. Not everybody wants the same kind of house. Okay. An international student coming to Canada, they basically need a bed. Like they don't have extensive need for a large amount of square footage. In Montreal, where my family lived for a number of years, our church was in the Park X neighborhood. Specifically, it was on a corner that was we were about 2 blocks from the big Sikh Gurdwara in the neighborhood. And in Park X, if you got on one of these like real estate listing websites, you don't rent an apartment, you rent a bedroom. Because it's one of these neighborhoods that's been highly affected by the surge in temporary migration. And these workers are often coming without families. And so they rent a bedroom. But when it comes to family formation, marriage and childbearing, you don't rent a bedroom. Okay? You need a house. You need places to put your kids. The simple fact is, demographers have known for decades, based on extensive research, that residential sorting, that is, sorting into the kind of place you live, geographically, architecturally, whatever, residential sorting and selection into family life are co-determined. What that means is, if I can't get a suitable house, I don't get married. And if I can't get married, I don't get a suitable house. Okay? These things are co-determined. They cause each other, so to speak. Which is to say, if we're not building houses that people want to have a second child in, they won't even get married. Okay? People can see they make forecasts of their own future. Okay? They look ahead and they say, gosh, I'm not going to get there, so I'm not going to go there. You don't start the journey if you don't think you're going to finish. So the fact of the matter is that over the last 10 years in Canada, I mean, you see this in a lot of countries, the US as well. the share of new housing stock that has been studio apartments is off the charts. We say, oh, we're building housing, we're building housing, we're building housing. Not for family life. We are not building housing for family life. We are building housing for celibacy, for singleness, for childlessness. And part of that is demand driven. People are doing these things later in life. And so builders are trying to respond to that demand. There's surges of temporary migrants who don't need family housing right away. Although even that, I think we overstate, because a lot of these people do end up having kids in Canada, or they bring their kids. There's a lot of complicated family arrangements that happen there. So the challenge is, we have a lot of builders, private and public, building houses that we know everyone sees as a temporary way station until they get to their real life. And that is not good for a society. It's not good for a society to have an explosively growing population seeing their life as in a temporary phase, on hold, on pause, until they can get to the part of it where their real life starts, where they can be married, where they can have kids. Okay, so when I think about housing, affordability, yes, affordability matters. Absolutely. There's nobody who, it'd be crazy to say that the affordability question doesn't matter. And so for that, since building a ton of apartments, maybe it reduces some housing stress on other types of housing. I'm not saying that's a terrible thing, but you have to build the houses people want to have kids in, okay? And Canada isn't. And there are regulatory reasons for that. There are demand. There are real kind of market demand reasons for that. And there are also market failure reasons for that. Cases where builders could do it. They're not prevented from doing it, but they're not doing it, basically due to information gaps, financing issues, and just kind of eccentricities of the housing market.
Okay. That's a really good summary of the connection. And then you've alluded to some of the policy issues that are preventing, or perhaps some market failures. So I'd like to hear from each of you on that. Lyman, we'll start with you. You mentioned some of them. Basically, there's a mismatch between the type of home that is conducive to family formation, and that's precluding it. And we've been focused, as you say, on kind of the urban low density. This has kind of been the mantra. Environmental movement has some influence on this, various factors. So perhaps you could speak to some of the issues around zoning, the types of homes that we need, and then we'll move on to the others from there.
So in terms of detailed policy stuff, I will say I am more familiar with the US policy context. There is definitely similarity. Yeah. But in principle, one of the things going on in the US, in Canada, in a lot of places is builders are seeing, oh, there's a lot of young single people, so they probably want apartments. And also, there's not a lot of unbuilt land within a short commute of jobs. Okay, there's just a limited supply of that land, and a lot of what remains is protected through urban growth boundaries, green belts, things like that. You can debate if, maybe there is some really important public good protected there, maybe. But I will say urban growth restrictions are the best predictor of excessive housing prices. So just land restrictions are the biggest issue here. So, but secondly, if you're a builder and you're like, gosh, there's huge demand for housing. If I build it, someone will buy it. But there's not much land. What are you going to do? Well, first of all, your lobbying efforts are going to be about making sure you can put as much house on that land as possible. And secondly, whatever you build is going to get bought at any price. So in some sense, you don't actually have to build what people want, right? If you build it in Toronto, it will sell, okay? So what's going on is, and you can even see this then in zoning, right? So often cities will be like, okay, we're going to upzone places within, half a kilometer of transit. And so you can see this in the Toronto skyline, right? It's actually, as an American, it's very weird driving around because Toronto is actually like 15 different dense urban centers that are all like 3 miles apart. Yes. But you can see the zoning, right? Because there's these like new apartment buildings going up, and then it's single family housing around it. And the single family housing mostly is actually low density. The result of this is that you have just huge amounts of housing going up that no one wants to raise a family in, even as the single family housing remains incredibly expensive because that's still what everyone wants. Mm-hmm. So now all the people in the high rises are looking down at the single family houses being like, I want that one. I've picked it out in advance. I'm waiting for the old couple in it to die. Fundamentally, what you actually need to do is you need to find a way to densify neighborhoods, okay? Not just build a tower. You need to find a way to more efficiently subdivide lots, remove older housing that is not an efficient use of space, and build, 2 single-family homes on what used to be a lot for one. Japan has some interesting precedents on how to handle this kind of tenure issue. We've seen some of this in some US states as well. Densifying neighborhoods with smaller lots, higher floor area ratios, but not necessarily sky-high height limits is the best solution here. And those are the neighborhoods that are also actually highest value. If you look at the neighborhoods that people just bid the prices through the roof, they are like dense single-family neighborhoods. They tend to be these like shady, tree-lined neighborhoods with small yards and like modest, not huge houses, not teeny tiny, but not huge, because that is what everyone wants. And that is where the pent up demand is. And it's what we're not building. And the reason we're not building it is because it doesn't make sense to build it 2 hours outside of town. But finding the land to build it in town is very difficult. So we have to find ways to break the essentially the inertia of current land distributions so that you can build, double density neighborhoods that are still single family homes. And it can be done. I live in one. Like my neighborhood, I have a yard. I have a big flat yard. My kids can play in it. I've got big trees. I have a driveway. I have a garage. And yet my neighborhood, the density is like 12,000 people per square mile. That's not low. That's not a low density neighborhood. That's like in the top 5 or 10% of American neighborhoods. Now, it's not high-rise density. It's not Manhattan, but that's a dense neighborhood.
Right.
And it's just a normal suburban neighborhood because the space is used very efficiently. It is compact lots for the most part. We could build that. We choose not to for regulatory reasons, and particularly because regulators, they are hesitant to implement the laws and rules and tenure arrangements that would allow neighborhoods to be converted in this way, partly because a small number of homeowners scream bloody murder as soon as their neighbor wants to subdivide their lot.
Okay. So let's stay on zoning for a bit, because there are a lot of other policy levers that affect, the price floor that we need to lower, I suppose, so that more homes can be built, including development charges, impact fees in the US. But on this question of zoning, Lyman, it sounds like you're aiming for, and I hear this as the 2 different poles of solution offered. It's, okay, we need to zone for more single family homes, or we need more, very dense but higher rise apartments. But what I think you're suggesting is we need some sort of flexibility in zoning that would allow for denser neighborhood home developments in the middle. Is that right?
Yeah. There's actually an interesting math problem that helps illuminate the issue. So people today generally want bigger houses than they wanted 70 years ago. Okay. We're richer. We want more space. That all makes sense. If you are in a legal regime that has minimum lot sizes and maximum floor area ratios, then there is which floor area ratio for non-experts basically means the total amount of square footage you can build as a ratio of the amount of land that you have. Okay. So if you have a low floor area ratio cap and a high minimum lot size, you can actually get to a situation where you can't build a house of the size that people want to buy. Or you can get to a situation where, okay, let's say nowadays people just want 4-bedroom houses. Okay, that's plausible. And they want like at least 2,000 square foot if they're going to buy a single family home. Okay, I think that's not a crazy belief of what a lot of people want. You have to have either a big enough minimum lot size, which means low density, which means wasting a lot of land, or you have to have a high enough floor area ratio. So the problem is some places are getting rid of minimum lot sizes, but they're not fixing the floor area ratio. And the actual cap is the floor area ratio. Okay. Because he said you can make the lot however small you want, but you can only use 10% of it for a house. In which case you can build a shack. So it's not just zoning. Zoning refers to like use, okay, like what you can use. And yes, zoning is an issue. There's places where there is unused land held by churches, schools, police stations, fire departments, companies, whatever, that could be houses. So we should get rid of use rules and allow people to build houses that might be higher value. But secondly, even in places that are zoned for residents, I think we need to think about getting more neighborhood life, building more of the neighborhoods that people want to live in. That means dealing with minimum lot sizes, dealing with setback rules. Setback rules waste a lot of land, dealing with floor area ratio rules. This is all very in the weeds. I don't know how in the weeds you want me to get.
No, it's good you're painting the picture. Yeah.
But like, this is the stuff that actually has to happen. And unfortunately, some of this is like not stuff you would do at a national level. I'll also say you get a paradigmatic example of this in First Nations held land. Because what's going on there is they have a totally fixed pot of land, right? Like this is their, I guess not treaty land in the cases I'm thinking of. This is the land they refused to sign a treaty for. And so then ultimately it was, they got the court to rule that it's very much their land because they didn't sign a treaty, right? So they can do whatever they want with it, which is like very cool, very great. Okay, love this. It's like ultra libertarian zoning rules for them. But the problem is perfectly fixed land supply for these developers, essentially. So what do you do when you're a developer and you know you will never get another inch of land? You go up as high as you can. And so that's what you see in a lot of these developments, like in British Columbia, that are being run by First Nations. They've done the math and they correctly realize like this is the way to get the most houses given the fact that we have the land. So I'm not saying they're doing something wrong, but I'm just saying you can actually see a test case where we know what happens when you tell a developer, you get this much land, you never get another inch, you can do anything you want, but you have zero land flexibility. What they do is they just go up as high as they can.
Okay, this is great. Sam and Bruce, I would love to hear your thoughts on this zoning land use set of policy levers that Lyman's referred to, or others that you think are very important to what we're aiming for. Sam, we will start with you.
Yeah, look, I agree. I think land use tools are super important. I'd like to, maybe highlight it here in Ontario. There was a really important report a couple of years ago, the Housing Affordability Task Force that the government put forward, and they made a number of recommendations, very micro, very, very specific. And at least here in Ontario, the government's acted on a lot of them, including really kind of forcing municipalities to change the way that they're operating with carrots and sticks. Here in Ontario, obviously the province has a lot of authority over municipalities, and there's a lot of really good ideas in there if you're looking for practical solutions, and the province has adopted a number of them. I think maybe a couple things on the politics of this is. I think Lime is right. Like, we're not building what people want. I think that's exactly right. I'm of the view I would like to see us push more on the expansion of urban boundaries to allow for more low-rise housing development outside. Like, I do think people really want that. Not everyone wants to live in a city. I live in the east end of Toronto. I'm in one of the neighborhoods kind of Lyman describes myself, but not everyone wants that. Some people don't mind the commute. Some people want a little bit more of a backyard, want to be a little bit more separate from their neighbors, right? So I do think one area that I'd like to see is really force municipalities to expand urban boundaries. And unfortunately, we do obviously have limited land, and there's green belts and other issues, but there still is land available that I think we can open up and really incentivize. As well, too, one of the real challenges at the practical level that I think really needs to be addressed is just the speed of municipal review processes for getting permits, right? And here in the province, they've done a few things to really speed that up, but like, there is no reason we should not say in Ontario here, let us have the fastest approval time in North America for a permit, and if the municipality cannot approve it, it is deemed approved in that period of time. game over, move on, let's go. Like, we should be able to build things a lot faster. That is a big challenge on the financing side, and the timelines cost money to developers. That ultimately costs money to the consumer, and we need to actually put, I think, much more push behind making things move faster through our system. I think right now we've got a lot of momentum in Canada to fix problems and to say, like, you know, like we can't be complacent anymore for a number of reasons. This is an area we need our politicians to push for.
Yeah.
And I would say, you know, the Ford government's done a lot on this. They can maybe go a little bit further and push municipalities.
Okay, Sam, I want to come back to you to get your take on the politics and the political feasibility in particular of some of these solutions. But first, Parisa, I would love to hear from you, your thoughts. And one we haven't touched on so much yet, if you care to try to address it, is the cost side of the equation. Of course, permitting time, zoning affects that. But another big one that gets a lot of attention is development charges. So I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Sure, absolutely. There is no doubt that all these elements and also development charges play significant role in terms of their contribution to unaffordability in the housing market. And these are the barriers that we need to focus on if we want to address, if we want to make faster housing and also address the issues that we are facing in the housing market and address barriers. But one thing I like to highlight, I totally agree with all the panelists talking about the barriers and also the type of housing we need. So there is a significant disconnection between the preference and also the type of housing we can make, and they are forced by, for example, economic constraint, in terms of the cost and also the timeline, delay, and all these factors play a role in terms of contributing to the issue and also addressing the issues at the same time. One thing that I want to highlight is that in terms of the zoning and also there is a City House study that discuss that it shows even when we are able to address all those barriers and address the housing issues in urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, we are not able to fully address the housing because these cities are attractive. So if there will be more, if they are going to address the shortages and provide more housing, more people will move to those regions. So the problem is that how to address the problem is that we need to think about building other cities bigger, because the big cities are attractive and people are looking for, those big cities provide better economic opportunities. We need also think about, for example, transportation and other services we need, for example, hospitals, schools, childcare. So if we need to shift the focus on, yes, this is really important to address housing and addressing all those barriers, the timeline, the cost, the fee, development charges. We need to do that in urban centers, but at the same time, we have to think about making other cities that they have potential to attract individuals to reside in them bigger. So this is something that we have to consider. People like to live in bigger cities, and that's a policy that we shouldn't ignore and we should pay attention to.
I think that's a great point. I certainly agree. It's almost as though, we've entered a point in our history where this kind of thing seems like behind us, and we're not into building new cities, expanding, what have you. But we definitely need to start thinking about that, because we have now just an accumulation of regulatory burden and no new outlets and valves for the demand. to take action. Whether they're doing it enough is another. So before we move on to the final question before audience, I want to return to this political feasibility question and ask that of you first, Sam, and others feel free to join in if you have thoughts. Because I would just say, for starters, like in Ontario here, the green belt has been tried, and due to a scandal, it seems unlikely, at least in the near term, that it will be a feasible path. And then there is the local resistance to zoning and land use changes. So I think it begs the question, do the provinces need to really step in here, or does even the federal government need to step in to kind of require certain actions in these areas where housing scarcity and affordability are most acute?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Maybe I'll start with a comment around the provincial framework, then get into what I think is kind of maybe a deeper political issue. So first, I think Doug Ford in Ontario, I think, deserves a fair bit of credit. In 2018, when he first was elected, he brought in a housing supply action plan. It was talking about a supply problem when the federal government, just a few years before, was still saying there was no supply issue, it was a demand problem. We're bringing mortgage stress tests to kind of tamp demand and saying supply is not the issue, it's all demand driven. Doug Ford was out here saying, no, it's supply driven. And I think he should get a lot of credit for trying to lead the charge and look at forcing municipalities to make changes. And I think that bought him a lot of credit politically. He's obviously won a few elections here. We saw the implosion of the Justin Trudeau government that I think was driven in large part from the housing issue, or it was one of the issues where he really wore that issue, I think somewhat unfairly at times, because it was a municipal and provincial issue at times, but he kind of wore that politically. And you saw that the politics of housing kind of play out in that regard in those two different levels. But I think right now, this past federal election shows kind of what I would say is a really big generational divide emerging in our politics around kind of all of these issues. You saw Mark Carney win here in Canada, really on the backs of older Canadians, homeowners, seniors, retirees, people who grew up in an era when they bought a home for $200,000. Yes, they'll say they had 18% interest, but 18% interest on a $200,000 home is a lot less than 5% interest on a $1.4 million home that these baby boomers like to tell me. So that they voted in Mark Carney, right? They voted in him because they saw the Conservatives as being disruptive to the status quo. Well, we're talking about disrupting the status quo in the housing market right now to fix some of these problems. We're talking about disrupting kind of the status quo to fix some of these issues. And there's a group of Canadians that I think we're looking for stability. And I think a lot of it's generational, as well as I would say kind of, the professional managerial class of people who have done well in the current environment. Their homes are worth a lot more than they used to be. They don't want to see home values go down. They understand the affordability challenges, but they're not really willing to look at kind of radical solutions to fixing a lot of these issues. And I think this is a real generational issue that's kind of emerging in our politics. I think you could look at family formation policy as well, like the Liberal plan for state-run subsidized daycares. Who does that help? It helps the professional managerial class in urban centers, right? It does not necessarily help the working class in as many ways. And so you see this kind of divide at a generational and an economic level that's really emerged in our politics. And I think what I worry over the next 5-10 years as baby boomers either sell their homes or die, unfortunately, this massive wealth transfer to a group of younger people who will inherit a whole lot of money, and the inequality in our system may be based upon when did your parents buy a home, not what job you have or where you're working in our society. And I really worry that at a generational level, this will have a very big impact on our type of politics. And it's something that we need to really, I think, address. We see a lot of polarization. We see a lot of kind of extremes. And I think those are only going to grow because of these kind of structural issues and the inequality that is being borne by a lot of this. So I think we need to address these things today. We need to think generationally. We need to think about how are we looking for future people young people? How are we addressing our public policies towards them, not just what works for me in today's moment or retirees? I think that is a fundamental thing we are going to have to address if we're going to really kind of have a cohesive politics kind of moving forward.
Okay. Yeah. Demographic divides very much at the heart of these demographic issues. Before we go to audience questions, I want to ask each of you about what you make of the recent developments on the policy front from federal and provincial governments on housing and, to a lesser extent, family formation issues. So the new federal government, they've touted GST exemption on new homes, created an affordable housing organization, focused on modular builds, and very recently on mass timber and kind of subsidizing the softwood lumber industry in light of trade threats to focus, I guess, on the input side of housing tangentially. And as I alluded to earlier on, in spite of, I think, what Sam said about some positive developments in Ontario, and BC has also done the same, we are seeing declines in housing starts in precisely those areas, that need the support and the change most. So what do you have to say about some of these recent proposals and what governments are doing and perhaps what they should be doing? Parisa, you're unmuted, so over to you.
Sure, absolutely. So what I can tell in regards to the responses from governments all levels, so it seems that they understand, they are aware of the issues, and they are moving in the right direction in terms of the policy and trying to come up with solutions to address the issues we are facing. But one thing that is really important to, for example, when it comes to technology, definitely we need to use technology to address housing, to build more and better, and also but the key part in the housing market is affordability. So the private sector, we need to make them involved, but the private sector respond to demand, not the need. So definitely there is a role for government. They need to understand what are the gaps and issues and address those barriers, to make it more, making basically more housing more affordable. This is something that really everyone needs to focus on. Otherwise, if it's not affordable and we add to the housing market, increase the supply, if the demand side is not able to afford to purchase those, it's something is lagging. And in terms of, for example, when it comes to immigration, we can't really shut down immigration because we have housing issues. We need even immigration to be able to address the labor needs, for example, in the housing market. But one thing that is really important and has been missing and we need to focus on, we need a connection between housing policy and immigration policy. And we know that it takes time, to be able to increase the supply in the housing market. And immigration, when it increases, it immediately adds to the demand. So we need to understand this lag between these two. We can shut down the immigration, but we need to use other policies to be able to create a connection and create a coordination. We need coordination not only in terms of the immigration and also in terms of the housing policy at all levels of government, and understand the issues and try to address those. There are positive steps, but we need more.
Yeah, for my part, I can say I know that is a huge gap, that the provinces don't know, where exactly immigrants are going, and so it does make it a little difficult to target one's housing policy to the changing flows. Sam, I see you're unmuted, so go to you next.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I would actually say on the immigration side, like, we really should be curtailing the temporary foreign worker program. I would actually go so far as we should abolish it and start from scratch and recreate a new program that serves needs. We have an immigration system that allows for economic immigration, and we should be looking to bring in immigrants who will be here long term and be part of our culture and our society, not rely on a guest worker class that I think is driving down Canadian wages and playing a pretty detrimental role in our society. And I think, unless the Liberal government federally is willing to address that problem, I think they're going to have a challenge on the housing side. And if they're really going to address that program specifically, I think too, you've seen from Mark Carney, this, government-run program to build homes. I'm very skeptical that the government will be able to figure this out when private developers have yet to. I think that's going to be a very failed initiative, and one that certainly, when Canadians go back to the polls, whenever it is, 24 months, 18 months, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, whatever it is, I think he will have to have shown some progress, and I'm really skeptical that the current plan of having the government build homes for us is a really feasible one.
Great. Over to you, Lyman.
Yeah, I mean, obviously supply side interventions matter, but the main thing driving cost of housing in Canada is not the cost of wood or the cost of bricks. I mean, look, I'm all in favor of having, a lighter regulatory touch on modular or on panelized homes. That's kind of an intermediate, it's great, especially for when you're more than 300 miles from the US border part of Canada, up there, it actually makes a lot of sense to think about having a lot more of a panelized housing and modular housing industry. Probably panelized is a better fit up there than modular, but at the end of the day, construction cost is not the limiting factor here. I mean, if you are a developer in Canada, you will make back your construction cost without a challenge almost anywhere in Canada. Mm-hmm. What you might not make back is the land cost, the financing, particularly as Sam said, and I meant to say this and I totally whiffed on it, but he was totally right about permitting time. The biggest uncertainty in a development project, the biggest thing that might cause you to go bankrupt is permitting time, right? If you thought you were going to carry the loan for 16 months and you actually carry it for 3 years, that's an issue. So I think it's just a red herring to say, oh, we're solving housing by, letting you use mass timber. Okay, mass timber is great. Love it. I'm all in favor, but that's actually not the problem. Housing prices are multiples of construction costs in many Canadian cities, not all, but in many. I mean, this just isn't a factor. So unless you are dealing with land, permitting time, financing, you're not in the game. It's got to be land availability, land use, permitting time, financing costs. This other stuff is it's not in the game. On immigration, I think what the other said was I think correct, that ultimately this is kind of a federal question of willingness to try and do something to manage the flow in some sense. And I appreciate, I forget if it was Parisa or Sam who mentioned this, that the challenge with curtailing immigration is that in your construction sector, a lot of the inputs for housing is immigrants. So if you get rid of all the construction workers, you in fact do not have housing. So yeah.
Let me follow up with one question before we conclude. There are so much of the policy levers, as we've discussed, are in fact at the municipal level, though the provinces have a great deal of influence. Are there municipalities, maybe Lyman, of some in the US? I know there are quite a few cities who are, pro building and homes conducive to family formation, that are doing things right or doing some things well that we should seek to emulate. Love to hear from any of you on that.
I'll jump in. I mean, it's not so much specific cities, but I mean, you can see that most of the metro areas in Texas have very flexible housing markets. They sometimes do have a run up in prices when there's a huge demand shock. I mean, Austin had one after COVID, but then it tends to come back down because they eventually build the houses that are necessary to meet that demand. And that has a couple of factors. One, lax zoning. I mean, all the types of things I've been talking about, really light zoning touch, very small or no minimum lot size, very flexible floor area ratios within the range of single family housing. That's all a factor on it. I actually want to mention there is another factor there in Texas, though, and that is quite high property taxes. High property taxes. And actually, I'll mention this is responsive to a question in the chat from a listener, Frederick. High property taxes make housing markets more efficient. Okay, they don't increase housing costs because they just capitalize into the price you pay when you buy the house. They almost fully capitalize, so they don't really increase the carrying cost. What they do is they shift some of the cost away from mortgage into tax, and what that does is it means that older people who might benefit from downsizing have more of an incentive to do so. And I know a lot of people don't like this. They say, oh, you shouldn't be kicking old people out of their house. I don't want to kick old people out of their house, but I do want them to pay their share of the cost of local government. And in fact, older people are major consumers of local government, particularly through local health services. So having a high and level property tax without a lot of carve-outs for older homeowners in particular is very important for a smoothly functioning property market, because most of the houses that are bought and sold are not new houses. They're existing houses. Mm-hmm. So I would say that's another key lesson from Texas is you should tax the crap out of houses.
That's a great point. And it can also help alleviate some of the impact fee in the U.S. and development charge burden here, which goes into
income taxes.
Or income taxes, yeah, which go into
just cut other taxes.
which go into financing some of these like amenities that are an infrastructure that is necessary for vibrant neighborhoods and communities, and would do so in a way that does not add to the upfront price tag. So in conclusion, this has been really fascinating discussion. Good to own in on both that we need to be thinking about the types of housing, and in particular neighborhoods that are conducive to family formation to help us deal with our demographic crunch issue, which has both social and considerable economic impacts, and to see how we might focus on some of these key policy areas like zoning, like land use, like some of the upfront costs, and also to see what's politically challenging and what's politically feasible to do so. So I want to thank each of you for being here with us. And thanks to everyone who tuned in to listen. Again, please like and subscribe Macdonald-Laurier Institute's stuff, and check out Sam, Parisa, and Lyman's work in their respective organizations. And thanks again for joining us.